Can y'all hear me? Should I use the mic? I don't know if the guest was can hear me. Use the mic. I'll just use the mic. So I think about the first circle as like we talked about in the panel a little bit, like or they talked about in the panel a little bit, like when a song is about a particular topic, or when a poem or movie or theater piece is explicitly dealing with a particular idea or issue, right? I think about art for activism more in terms of well, so like again, this first one, the key word here is content. Like, what is it about, or what is it trying to say? What's its message? When I think about art for activism, the key word for me is context. Not you don't have to read what I'm writing; it's more just a visual aid. It's sideways and looks funny, but context. So, like art for activism, I think about fundraisers, raising money for organizations. I think about signal boosting. A good example back home in Minneapolis was an MC named Brother Ali. Brother Ali has I don't know 50,000 Twitter followers, right? There was a movement a couple years ago around occupying foreclosed homes so that the banks couldn't come and foreclose those homes because people were literally physically in them, which really was it was an outgrowth of Occupy. It's called Occupy Homes in Minnesota. And the thing is, they had, 3,000 Twitter followers. So the idea that when Brother Ali retweeted them, which he did very, very often, or like signal boosted what they do, that for me is an example of an artist using the platform that they have and the space that they have access to for activism. And then thinking about art as activism is maybe a little more muddy. The best example that I can think of in my head is the SNCC Freedom Singers, who, if any of y'all know your movement history, is like civil rights history, right? Like dogs and fire hoses and police and everything like that. To me, it's a great example of like a concrete function of art in like being part of a movement. And I think this is much more. This is a complex circle right here. And a lot of stuff like overlaps into each one of these. But I thought one way to start would be all of us. And again, not thinking about these specifically right now. If we can go anywhere in the circle, because I would love to hear examples for you of art that you would say like intersects with an issue or movement or social justice in a general sense in a way that is effective. So, like any song or play or book or anything from your experience that we could make a list of. I'm actually gonna make a new list. Anything else? Oh yeah, yeah. Which is not a group that comes up in this conversation very much, but that's great. It's a good example. Oh yeah. So people don't know there's a new film coming out, not called Birth of a Nation, but The Birth of a Nation, I think, which is about Nat Turner, the slave rebellion. The Birth of a Nation. You mentioned the Laramie Project, which is another good example. Oh yeah. I don't I can't write that. Okay. Any more? Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me put a few of my own up as people are still thinking. Just examples that come to mind for me that have been influential to me. I also had the Larry Project on mine. I think we could. There's a million specific ones, but we could just put like in general, like labor era folk songs, like Woody Guthrie and stuff. Um, yeah. Let's see. Let's see. All right. So NWA was mentioned a little bit. So I'm thinking about two songs in particular. One is the classic NWA song, like "F the Police," right? There was a song a couple of years ago by three artists, B. Dolan from Providence and Jasiri X from Pittsburgh and Toki Wright from Minneapolis called Film the Police, which was kind of a reinterpolation of the original, but about the specific idea of the power of using our smartphones to film police activity. So just I think two different examples that are both belong on this list, but like in different ways about how art intersects with those types of movements. I also let me just throw up one more real quick. If people know Carl Walker, Carol Walker, the sculptor, really cool stuff. And I want to put Paul Robeson up here. As examples, again, in the last workshop, talking a little bit about how it isn't just about what the artist talks about, it's about the artist as like a person in a community, in a society. Like Paul Robeson wasn't always singing super political songs, but Paul Robeson was an incredibly political person. And just as an artist, he had access to these platforms and stuff. Um, there's a million others. People have any more to add to this list before we keep going? Anyone who doesn't know? Okay. Oh, okay. I'm writing sideways, but benefits. Definitely. Any in particular? Yeah, yeah. I'll underline this. Yeah, so like one of the things again, I think sometimes this conversation always goes to like art about issues. But I do think that those like big fundraising things, we can talk about the pros and cons of those big fundraising things, but like that's part of this conversation. About consent. People ever saw this about comparing consent to tea, like drinking tea. Like someone tea, you can't make someone drink a cup of tea without their consent. In the same way that sex can't happen without consent. And again, using things like video, web video, and like web comics, and like smaller types of art can be on this list. I'm a guy from Minneapolis. Think about Prince, right? So Prince's music wasn't always super political, but Prince gave a lot of money to like super progressive causes, and like Prince was a philanthropist, right? I think about things like Shepard Fairey, who did the Obama poster during the first campaign, in terms of how like visual art can play into this. Also, one other example that came up earlier today was Ohio State, I think, had I'm just writing what I'm saying. They had a poster campaign called "Culture Not a Costume," showing like a person from a particular culture holding a photograph of a white person dressed as someone from their culture for Halloween. And the whole thing was a poster campaign talking about how like that's not okay to dress like someone's culture for Halloween. And it's a really cool, again, visual art, photography that's spread all around the country to be something that colleges do every Halloween now to put up these campaigns. Yeah, the AIDS Club. People have seen that. And again, we can keep going. I think this is a good list to draw from. And there's a million more things up here. We talk about graffiti and like we can talk about Banksy and all that kind of stuff. I have a million local examples, but part of this workshop. So part of this workshop is looking at this list and thinking about anything that's in your head that isn't on this list, and drawing out techniques or approaches, both in terms of like if you're an artist and you want to create political art, like what moves people, what's effective, but also in terms of how this art functions, like in reality, in real life, like how a particular song or whatever has helped build a movement. And like this can be really complex, can also be things that are really simple. Well, I have my own list here, but maybe right away. Does anything on this list stick out in terms of like, do you see things that elements on this list share in terms of their approaches to creating the art? I know that's kind of a complex question. So one, they're all created consciously, and one that social injustice is being addressed. I think about the word that I really like here is intentionality. The idea that it's one thing to just like do good stuff, but it's something else to do something really, really specific in terms of thinking about who your audience is and thinking about who your target audience is, who your likely audience is, etc. The metaphor that I think about with this is so like my job is I travel around the country. I go to colleges usually and like do poems about social justice issues, about like consent and feminism and race and identity stuff. And I think about the Johnny Appleseed metaphor of like you skip through the meadow and you throw a bunch of seeds out and like trees maybe sprout. But then the flip side of that is like planting crops, like very intentionally, like farming. And the idea that like we can plant wildflower seeds and that's beautiful, but when we're intentional, when we're doing something really, really specific, that can be more maybe, to use a cliche word, like revolutionary. I don't know. But both of those comments made me think about that. I'm gonna throw one of mine up while just as another example, kind of. All right. So I think about a lot of the things on this list are about telling stories. And I think in particular, juxtaposing the idea of like narrative, telling stories, versus just like saying what you want to say, or just statistics, maybe something we can put over here, versus statistics and like logical arguments. Again, logical arguments aren't bad, but they're not always effective when you're trying to convince someone of something. I mentioned, Minnesota was the first state out of 30 to defeat a constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage. And there was a reason that we were the first state to defeat one of those bans. A huge part of it, well, I mean, many reasons, but a huge part of it was that the campaign very, very intentionally focused on storytelling, as opposed to saying, like, here are the economic reasons why we should have same-sex marriage, or here are the constitutional reasons. They just said, like, this is my uncle. I want you to meet my uncle. His name is Brian. Blah, 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 blah. And, like, tell that story and have people's faces. Like, I think about this list, there's a lot of that going on. The Laramie Project. People haven't seen the Laramie Project or read it. Like, that's an incredibly powerful story, even apart from everything else that it's talking about. Any other common themes? Oh, yeah. Titles, that's a really, really good point. Titles I find end up being a huge reason why like a particular poem or song will go viral as opposed to not go viral. But I think about this in a deeper sense about the idea of hooks. Now sometimes hook is used to mean like the chorus to a song, but I'm thinking about hook as both in terms of songs and poems, but also like media campaigns. It's the thing that makes it different. It's like the structuring principle that makes your like poem about the prison industrial complex different from the 800 other poems I've already heard about the prison industrial complex. And like a hook is an incredibly powerful tool for artists and also for organizers. I think especially in a media sense, like if someone hands you a flyer that says like rally for justice on Wednesday, like you might go if you're interested in the topic. What if it's something really, really specific? I'm trying to think of some good examples of hooks. Yeah, hashtag. Yeah, Black Lives Matter is a hook. It's very simple, straightforward. You can fit it in a tweet. Any other hashtags that you were thinking of maybe? Idle no more? Definitely. Oh, yeah. The yes all women, not all men. Occupy. Occupy is a good hook. I mean, people had critiques of it too in terms of like whose land are we occupying, but like in general, it was a very good hook. There was a reason for. Let me give you a concrete example. So like, all my poems are on the internet, right, as videos, and like some of them have a lot of views, some of them don't have a lot of views. And the one poem I have that like has a lot of views in terms of like going viral or whatever, and having over like 1 million views, is a poem called 10 Responses to the Phrase "Man Up." And it got viral not because it's a great poem, but because it has a really strong hook. The poem is literally, I say, 10 responses to the phrase "man up." 1, blah 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 blah. 2, blah 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 blah. 3, and like that's the poem, right? And I think it's the idea that is more powerful than me just saying like, here are some reasons why we shouldn't have to fit into gendered boxes all the time. Like that's not a good hook. And we could go on with this for a long time, but I think that's good. Any other observations about this list? Yeah. Yeah, so I'm writing. There's different ways to say this, like how we make things that are complex, simple. And I think somewhat you could also say vice versa, like taking simple things and like showing the nuance to them that people might not always see. But I think this is really, really important. And I think it has to do with hooks too. It also has to do with telling stories. One thing I would add up here that relates to all three of these points is the importance of like concrete language versus abstract language. If any of you are, remember your high school creative writing classes or whatever, the idea that a word like freedom or injustice or pain or solidarity, like we know what those words mean, but they're abstract because you can't touch solidarity, right? You can't take a bite out of it. It's an idea. Whereas when we talk about really concrete things, that makes all the difference. The example that I always use is because I've worked with a lot of young people around writing, spoken word and stuff. And it's like writing a poem about war versus writing a poem about what it's like to stand in your brother's empty bedroom. Or writing a poem about the environment and how like the environment's important and like we should fight for it. Versus writing a poem that tells the story of like a polar bear who is starving to death. Like that's sad, but it's much, much more like grabbing than just talking about like in 7 years the temperature will go up by 0.6% or like that kind of thing, right? And I think a lot of these examples really, really use that as well. And not always. That's one thing about this is that like I think about them as tools, not rules. Like you can break any of these rules and still create a really brilliant piece of art. But these are good like guiding principles, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So relatability. The idea of being able to take a big universal topic and zoom in on it in a way that like makes sense for my actual life as a human being, right? Let me share something. We'll flip back to this page, but I want to draw something real quick. This has been really useful to me as an artist. I hope it's going to be useful to you too. I didn't invent it. I have no idea where it comes from, but it's a picture, and it's the story of two people, right? So the sun's out, and that's the earth, and this person every day walks along the beach with a metal detector, right? And a metal detector can reach down like 2 feet into the ground. They'll go from point A to point B and find some quarters or whatever you find with a metal detector. This other person is an archaeologist. And their job is also just to dig into the ground looking for stuff, but the approach is different. They take a small piece of land and dig down. Because that's where you'll find the like dinosaurs, right? And treasure chests. And I think this is really, really useful for artists But again, not just artists, but like for activists, people who do media campaigns, and people who are trying to like use their social media to make it whatever. The idea that the more ground that we try to cover, the less deep we can usually get with it, right? So instead, how do we choose something small rather than writing about or creating art about ideas, themes, or issues? We create work about moments and scenes and objects. And this goes back to the idea of concrete language versus abstract language. About specificity. How do we zoom in on something so that it's real and it's relatable? Some other examples we talk about are like, let's see. I don't know why this is the first one that pops in my head because most of the people that I know don't like the song. But Macklemore, Same Love, right? It's a song on a broad level about like, being accepting and like how same-sex marriage is cool. Like again, he released a song during a time when Washington was also dealing with a referendum, right? But it tells very specific stories. It seems that you can close your eyes and you can like see what's happening in the song. And I think that's really important. Does this make sense? Yeah.
Kind of like exploding the moment. Like in a creative writing class, obviously we learn about that, but like exploding the moment, kind of making it, using words to make people relate to it, relate to whatever you're feeling or whatever you're trying to get across.
You did say exploding the moment, right?
I did.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I think one of the most useful things that we talk about with young people who are writing poetry is that like you don't necessarily have to go outside of yourself to find something brilliant to write about. Like you find the things that you already have access to, and well, one, explore them. Like what makes that one moment in your life something that's meaningful, but then like really, really dig into them. I've never heard this exact phrase, but I think this is exactly that idea. It's again really important, especially when we're talking about political stuff, right? This relates to love poems and poems about like I'm sad because life is terrible, but it also relates, I think, very much to political and social justice oriented art. Any others? This is great. This is a good list already.
About validity and feeling valid and validity.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Like people's emotions are valid. Like somebody say like, "Hey, I'm uncomfortable with what you're saying," instead of brushing it off and be like, "No, I didn't mean it like that." Like, no, like you made me uncomfortable.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that takes a lot of practice as an artist to be able to like. I mean, you use the word already, to be comfortable with and like to sit with that. I think that's really, really important. There was another.
So going back to your picture, uh, using the same love thing, pretty much he used a big, like he scanned the floor for that main thing of digging deep. So it may have seemed like it was scanning, it was digging deep to find the idea, the story, the object that is the main thing. So you have a good feeling of the whole little thing. What
Yeah.
you're saying.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're touching on a really important idea that like when you are able to focus on the small thing, you get to still talk about the big things. You just get to talk about them in a way where you can add detail and depth and nuance to them. Or at least that's the idea. Again, not every not the same way, but yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Risk.
I said that like risk. That's great. I think that I put it up here by intentionality, which I think is really important. I also would say acknowledging the audience, like who the audience is, and then like pushing them, challenging them, maybe taking a risk where they're not gonna like you. I do a lot of poems about like organized, institutionalized, heteropatriarchal, capitalist white supremacy. A lot of people don't want to hear that, right? But I think it's also important because even if they don't like it, they've heard it, and I think sometimes that's all you have to do as an artist is like plant that seed. And I mean, there's more. We could have a long conversation about that, but I really like that word up here, definitely.
Kind of ties into the risk thing, but like they don't dance around the topic. They explain it like in depth, sort of like with the telling stories thing. Like they don't generalize it. Like they tell stories.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think another drawing. If we're gonna make a couple of drawings here, that's really useful. At least has been to me. And I think you're touching on this is like a spectrum of on one end of the spectrum is like so blunt that it's hardly art at all. It's just like saying the thing that you want to say, which sometimes can be a really effective thing. Like sometimes you do have to get up on stage and be like, "Hey, everyone, let's vote," or whatever. On the other end would be like so abstract that it hardly means anything at all. Like it might be political to you, but like no one else can hear that it's in there. And I think most art falls somewhere in the middle. And I think there are totally pros and cons to being at any spot on the spectrum. Like most of my work is probably like right here. I have friends, their work is like over here. Some of my other friends might be right in the middle. Some of my other friends are over here. Like whatever, you can do cool things, but I think that this spectrum is really useful to be intentional about, to figure out who your audience is and what kind of thing you want to give them. One real good example of this, a real life example, is like, I'm a spoken word poet and I'm an MC. And like, in terms of the writing, there isn't a whole lot of difference. You know, rapping, it rhymes, it's to music. Spoken word doesn't have to be, and like, that's kind of the only difference. The big difference is context, in that when I do spoken word, it's usually in like a theater where everyone is sitting down and it's completely quiet and they're staring at me and they're listening very intently to what I have to say. Whereas when I play a hip hop show, I'm standing up, the audience is standing up, they're moving around, they're drinking beer, they're like flirting with each other, they're not paying attention to me, whatever. So my music tends to be more over on this side of the spectrum. My poetry tends to be more over on this side of the spectrum. And again, I don't think one is better than the other. They're just different approaches to that framework. Cool.
One important thing is that a lot of this art down here wasn't used as like exploitation from outside of the group that it affected. A lot of it came from internally for people that were in the demographic that they're working for. The AIDS quilt was started in the community, like things like that. Fight the Power, of course, was about the Black community and poverty and everything. So like, whenever a large corporation starts a movement, it's not really going to be like it's not effective, but it's not going to be like personal. It's not going to be real, genuine.
Oh, that's great. I'm writing down a couple of things based on that. One, just the idea that identity matters. Like it isn't the same when two people who are different do the exact same poem. Like it does matter who we are, what communities we represent, where we come from, right? And I think one thing that I talk about with students a lot is the importance of telling your story, not trying to tell someone else's story for them, right? So like, as a poet, I can stand up on stage and be like, if I want to write a poem about racism, one, that poem could be, "Hey everyone, stop being racist. You're racist and that's bad and I'm great." Like that could be a poem, right? Another poem could be, "This is what it's like to be oppressed." And like, I'm mixed, but like I look very white. So like I can't write that poem, right? What I can write is a poem about what it means to say witness racism and like how do I respond to that? Or what it means to be complicit in a system that is racist. And like I have poems about that, which I'll do tomorrow at my performance. Like how do we intersect our own identities and experiences into these issues in a way that isn't, like you said, exploitative and like trying to tell someone else's story for them. One way to do that, which I wrote down here, is how you turn the lens on yourself. I hate to keep using myself as an example, but I'm great. So like, that was inappropriate. I'm sorry. So, but like, I have a poem about I might do this tomorrow at the performance too. I have a poem about like rape culture and sexual assault. And the idea of that poem is that it's not saying that all these terrible men out here are bad, terrible people. It's about saying like, look at me and my friends in this culture that we exist in, whether we like it or not, we exist in this culture. Because I think that turning the lens back on yourself means it points us towards action. Like, what are we going to do about it? As opposed to being able to point the finger. And again, not all of the examples on this list do that. It's like, it's a tool, it's a technique that you can use. Definitely. This is great. Usually I have to like do all this work myself, but y'all have a lot of good ideas. Any others?
There's a lot of like, and especially this comes to what he had said about like marginalized communities being the ones that put these ideas forward. There's a lot of like directness and like action verbs, like fight the power, we shall overcome. Like it's very confident, and it's confidence that's coming from people that usually you don't even hear them. So it's like that has a certain punch to it that maybe helps it spread around, I guess. I think.
Active voice. I mean, that makes me think about, like, there's a whole other conversation we could have about the various functions of art, right? Like, some art exists to educate people. Some art exists to inspire people. Some art exists to challenge people. Some art exists just for a specific community. Some art exists to speak to a different community. And, like, all of that is valid. But it's, again, going back to intentionality. But I think, yeah, that made me think about that. But that's a good point. Let me throw another one up of mine. All right, so this is a big part of my work as a poet. I'm running out of room here. I'll put it at the top. Is I think as artists, we have a lot more freedom to ask questions. Like, I get brought to a college, and they're like, here are 400 undergrads. Talk to them for an hour, right? And, like, as a poet, I'm not a professor. I'm not, like, a motivational speaker or, like, a TED Talk or whatever. I can just perform poems that ask questions and grapple with ideas and explore ideas, as opposed to, like, having all of the answers and being super didactic. I think that's one of the things that some of my favorite pieces of art do that. I mean, sometimes they are didactic too, and, like, that's okay. But for me, a lot of my favorite pieces of art give us as people space to ask questions and wonder about things and figure stuff out for ourselves, as opposed to me being on stage and, like, telling everyone what's up. That's been important to me. Any others? One thing that came up in the last discussion too, I don't know where I'm going to write this, is I'm going to write the word space. The idea that it isn't just about the art itself, but it's about the space that we can create through our art. So, like, back home in Minneapolis, I work with an organization called True Art Speaks. We do, like, youth poetry slams, right? And the whole idea of that is that it isn't necessarily about turning every young person into a brilliant poet, although we work on craft skills and stuff like that. But it's about how can we help cultivate a space where we can all just come together and tell our stories? And how can we cultivate a space where people are validated for what they believe in and what they have to say, when they're not always validated in school or in their everyday lives? How do we create a space where it isn't even us as adult staff creating these spaces, but it's just sharing the tools so that the young people can create the space themselves, and we're not even part of it anymore? Like, that's really, really beautiful to me. I think that's a huge part of arts communities as well. Which, again, one of those places where arts organize or intersects with organizing, and that point.
Speaking of that, Columbus just started its own queer open mic. Is one thing that they just did. There's another open mic that's specifically for a safe space. That's more about catering to the audience and help caretaking for them rather than, like, to censor anybody else. If they do have an issue within, they can take the audience member that's having a problem aside, kind of, like, cater to them in case it's triggering or trauma or whatever. So, like, Columbus right now is doing a lot in regards to space, especially within the poetry community and performance community.
So my thought was, for the last, like, 15 minutes we have, just to take all of these ideas and, like, kind of do a case study or think about, like, how this applies to your work as whatever you do in this room, whether you're a ComFest volunteer or part of an activist organization or you're a poet or whatever. Like, how can some of this be applicable in a really, really concrete, real world way? Like, that's one way we could take this conversation. But we could also just, like, talk. People have questions for me or for the group based on this stuff, or just anything people want to talk about. We have, like, 10 minutes or whatever, right? 15? Okay. So, do we have a mic still back there?
On my college campus right now, where you're talking a lot about the concept of allyship and being an ally in different parts of different activist movements, being an ally for women, being an ally for people of color, being an ally for the pride community. So just your thoughts on being a good ally, and is any advice for different allies?
I mean, I actually do a whole other workshop on deconstructing the idea of allyship, which, again, that's not me being, like, a brilliant social justice genius or whatever. Like, lots of people are talking about how the concept of allyship has to be deeper than it usually is thought about, right? Like, it has to be the idea that it's not something that we are, but it's something that we do, right? Like intentionally and ongoingly and concretely. Despite like I might be a really wonderful person in my brain, but like how does that play out in real life every day? Like that's a big part of this conversation. I think I can put this through the frame of being an artist, specifically. I think that again, going back to this idea of how does all this stuff come to life in our practice as individual people. I think one of those things is intentionality around space. So like I don't play shows when there aren't any women on the lineup, or I don't play shows when it's a hip hop show and it's all white people. And they might be great people, they might be great artists, but like just being intentional about how we have power to cultivate space and like impact our scenes, right? I mean, I could do a whole other list. Yeah. So curation and lineups. I think like curating a specific space, but also like something like ComFest. Like I know there was, I don't know if controversy is the word, but about like how ComFest has intersected with hip hop over the past few years, and how there was a very intentional push this year to get more hip hop on the bill. But I think this also relates to like who is doing the curating, right? Like from the beginning, who is the staff of a particular organization? Who is the promoter at a particular club? Who has the power in whatever situation that might be? And thinking very like again, going back to this idea of allyship, it can't just be like I have power, so I'm going to do good things for other people. But it has to be about like diffusing that power and sharing that power. Definitely. There was another.
There's a band called Power Bottom. It's actually like a ridiculously good band, and in their writer for their shows, they require that the venues have gender neutral bathrooms. Even if just for that night, they require that the venues have gender neutral bathrooms, regardless if they're the opener or the headliner or anything. Every show they play has to have a gender neutral bathroom. That's just like kind of intentionality and like making sure your audience feels cared for. And like there's a bunch of bands within I guess the pop punk scene or whatever doing that. Yeah, I mean like there's bands that have a straight phone number for their manager that if you feel sexually harassed, you call their manager and their manager gets the person that's sexually harassing you like taken away by security. Like that's just a very intentional way to make your audience feel safe and make sure that you can go to like places that you should feel safe at, I think.
Yeah, and I think that relates to the idea of risk, as someone said a moment ago. And how like that might mean that you get less shows. That might cut into like your money at the end of the day. But like if again, allyship has to be about what we do in a sustained way. And sometimes that might mean turning down certain shows, making less money. And so it's tough, right? And like it's also about our own positionality and my own positionality in like I can do a bunch of poems about like feminism because I'm a cisgender guy and like people clap like, oh, that you're so brave or whatever. Whereas like, and like that's why I don't do poetry slams anymore because like I had an unfair advantage because I talk about social justice stuff, but because of my own positionality and like my identities, it kind of gave me an advantage. So thinking about that with regards to this stuff, I think is really something that I've been grappling with and trying to figure out. I don't have it figured out, but yeah, this is great.
I ran a marginalized showcase for Columbus or whatnot for a while, where like all the artists fit into one marginalized group or another, or multiples or intersections in between or whatnot. And I emceed it throughout the whole thing. They always had the option to say everything they wanted about themselves, which didn't cut into their time. So where the MC wasn't cutting into their time, they could say they had as much to say about themselves. So it wasn't just me as a straight white male like getting mic time. Like look what a good job I'm doing with this marginalized showcase. They got to say everything for themselves and what they were about, and what the night meant to them, and not just me and putting it together. So as far as like doing or not, I'm not patting myself on the back, but that's something that a lot of promoters I think need to be keen to, is that they do it for personal gain. Again, going back to exploitation or whatnot. Look how good we're doing, rather than letting the artists do it for themselves.
Yeah, that's I don't know what to write exactly, but like the idea of credit. I will say I think there's a complexity around the idea of what's the word? It's an A word. When you do something because you're a wonderful person, it's altruism, right? There's a complexity around like altruism and sustainability where like if someone does the right thing for the wrong reasons, I mean maybe it makes it less sustainable, but like or if someone does the wrong thing for the right reasons, like I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but like I am thinking about that nuance and that complexity. But in a general sense, yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying.
I was just thinking about like when we're creating our art in general, right? Like I think it's important for us to focus on like there is a dominant narrative in almost everything that we're talking about, and you were talking about the narrative aspect of all of this. And if we try to find the part of our story that fills in the narrative that's missing, and we take that and we go with that as artists, I think it's really important. I mean, I don't know, that's like a huge focus of my work. Like, you know, and so I'm not patting myself on the back. Yes, I am. I don't give a shit. But like, it's like important, right? It's important to tell the story that no one hears, right? Especially when you're talking about consent earlier, right? Like we all know about the story of like the asshole drunken frat dude who like goes and like assaults some innocent flower. But what about like the narrative of some, you know, like somebody who people think has it coming and stuff? Like you tell your story as the person who had it coming, right? Then that I think is brave and it fills in. Or talk about the things that you gained from your experience as opposed to the things that you lost. You know, and still be like, fuck this, it's bad. But at the same, I'm taking up too much of the time on this mic. I'm just thinking like narratives that fill in what's missing from the dominant cultural narrative, right? We need to complete the picture because what we have is a lot of like corporately owned, corporately supported television shows and movies, and like you have the Laramie Project, you have things like that are fantastic, but where are the stories that we never hear? And we all have stories that we never hear. We all have them, and we should tell them. You know, shut up.
I've actually been I'm trying to share things that have been useful to me, right? And like one thing that's been really useful, just in terms of getting out of writer's block and like hating myself and all that stuff, is when you sit down to write something, it isn't necessarily like how do I write something that is amazing or beautiful or perfect, but I'm asking the question like what do I already have to add to this larger dialogue? But like it's not me who has to talk about every element of consent. I have to talk about that issue from my own perspective with my own story, like telling that thing. And that doesn't mean necessarily has to be like you can only ever write about completely true, real stories. Like we can make stuff up, we can be creative, but it always has to come from like a very honest place inside of us. It has to be like something that is our story to tell. And I mean, I know we're like out of time, right? And this is just the beginning of a very, very long conversation. Do you want to get this out and then we'll...
You've also mentioned it a few times, but I think like you said that like you said that it was important for people to talk about their own experiences, but it's also important to know when to step back and to let other people speak about their experiences as well. Like I've heard you like you touched on that, he's touched on that, but it's like it's important to like know when you should let them speak.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that point. To wrap up, let me just say again, this is an ongoing conversation that we could talk for hours and hours about. I have a lot of this stuff in my website of just like my own writing and videos and linking to other people's stuff about all these topics we've been talking about. If anyone is interested when we're done, I'm performing tomorrow on the main stage at like 3:50 or something. I think that's the time. My name is Guante, right? I'm going to be doing spoken word. I might do a couple of songs too, but it's a spoken word set. So please come check that out. Tell your people. As for right now, as we wrap up, I do have bookmarks that have my website, Twitter, Facebook on them. All my videos are online. I didn't perform at all during this workshop, but you can check it out online. And tomorrow, hopefully. I also have CDs. I travel here from Minneapolis. If anyone wants a CD, they're like, pay what you want. It's a sampler. So, like, come get at me. I wish we could talk all day, but thank you.
Thank you. That was amazing, Guante. And speaking of CDs, make sure you stop by the merchandise table to pick up some art from